Hello everyone, my name is Hannah Collison from Inspired Creations Surrey School of Sugarcraft, and here's another of our tutorials, this time an introduction to piping using royal icing on cookies or biscuits. Here's a picture of the project. And we're going to be learning a number of techniques today: runouts, some piped border designs, brush embroidery, and some pressure piped flowers as well. So it's quite an exciting lesson, this one. If you'd like to join in, then you can email me to ask for the kit list, and my contact details are just here. And here's a picture of the projects. For the purposes of today's lesson, I'm going to be demonstrating just in green and white, which makes it much simpler for you to prepare and work alongside. First thing I'm going to show you is how to prepare the piping bags using couplers instead of just inserting the piping tip into the bag. This gives you the opportunity to be able to unscrew and interchange the piping tips depending on what you want to pipe. That means also that you only need to prepare one bag with one colour and one consistency. So today I'm actually the plan is to prepare 2 bags with run out icing in and 2 bags with medium consistency royal icing, which is what you can normally pipe with. The runouts are for the flooding of the cookies. So to put your coupler in, take off the screwy part at the end, and the funnel piece needs to be inserted into the bag. Push it right to the end of the bag, and then where the U part is, you've got like a U cut out here. I'm just going to score across. If you haven't got a little cutout as your guide, then just score below the first thread. Push the coupler back into the bag and then cut straight across where you've scored with the scissors, and push the coupler back through the bag. And wherever you've scored, that should be where the bag stops. And then you can insert a piping tip on there and secure it by twisting the end band around. Okay, we're going to do that to all of the piping bags. We've got 4 piping bags today. Okay, so there's all my bags prepared. We have a Wilton 102, a PME number 8, an ST51, which is a PME tip, and a PME number 2. So there are other brands, but those are the ones I'm going to be using today. The royal icing recipe is on the back of the kit list, and you can email me to ask me for the kit list and the recipe for the royal icing. The recipe itself will give you a batch, which is enough, more than enough, to make about 20 biscuits, if not more. The recipe itself will take you to a stiff consistency royal icing, not stiff, sorry, a medium consistency royal icing, which is suitable to pipe with. The way to test it is to dig your knife in, and then the peak should come up and then topple over. This is a little bit on the loose side, only because it's been raining today, so it's a little bit moist. So if your royal icing is a little bit soft, you can go ahead and add a small amount of icing sugar. Give it a good old stir around the bowl. I use a glass bowl rather than a plastic bowl. That's a bit helpful because if you use a plastic bowl, sometimes you can make scratches in the bowl. And if you're working with the colour might seep into the scratches. And when you come to use it for white royal icing again, you could find that the colour comes through into your fresh royal icing. So the test is to push your knife in and lift the knife up, and it should go to a peak and then flop over. So in my opinion, this is still too soft, so I'm going to add a little bit more. So having added and combined some more fresh icing sugar that's gone through a fine mesh sieve, I can now test my royal icing, and it should peak up and then flop over, okay, but not too quickly. So I think that's probably about ready to go. So this is going to be my medium consistency royal icing that's going to be loaded into the bag, and this is going to be used for the brush embroidery and any plunged flowers, any pressure piped flowers that I want to create. If we want it for flooding, then it needs to be let down with water and much looser. To load the bag, if you take the piping bag that you prepared with the coupler, this is the number 2 writer. Turn the top edge of the piping bag over, but you only have a little bit of bag to load. This is going to help because the royal icing isn't going to stick to the edge of the bag and be unusable. You've only got a small quantity going in here, kind of a knife scoop's worth. Okay, so try and load up your royal icing onto the knife. I have, while I was beating it, I have actually checked, or actually I should show you that it needs to look quite smooth as you run the palette knife side to side on the bowl. And this is so that you don't get too many air bubbles in your piping when you pipe. It can be frustrating because then you get pops and gaps in your work. So just smooth the royal icing against the side of the glass, and then gather the quantity together and load it into your turned over bag. I'm just going to put my hand into the bag, open up the section that I want to feed it into, and then get that quite cleanly right down to the bottom. And then you can turn the bag the right way up. Just ease all the royal icing down to the bottom of the bag, and then you can close the bag up. I have a little bag tie here which is from Wilton. You can just stretch that over the back of the bag and then put the anchor part through the other end, and that will seal the royal icing in. Now, while you're not using the piping tip, you need to have it placed under a cloth so that it doesn't dry out. So I've coloured a similar quantity and treated it in the same way with gooseberry green spectral paste colour, which is absolutely fine as long as you don't put too much in. Then the fact that the colour's got glycerin in it might mean that it'll just take a little bit longer to dry. So I'm just scooping that into the bag with the number ST51 from PME, or you might have the Wilton 352. Either or, they're both absolutely fine for piping leaves. So that's your 2 medium consistency royal icing bags, and now we're going to move on to how to prepare your royal icing for flooding. So royal icing that you're preparing to a flooding consistency is going to be what you use to actually flood the surface of the cookie. And that needs to be let down, adding water to your royal icing mix so that it's flowy enough to actually be able to coat the biscuit, but not too flowy that it's going to overrun the biscuit. The first thing I need to do is add the colour. That way, once I've added the colour, I'll know what my consistency is and I'll know how to adjust it. If you add the colour after you've made it into runout icing, you'll find that you may be too runny and you'll have to add icing sugar to firm it up again. So just use a cocktail stick into your colouring. Any paste or gel colour will be absolutely fine. Preferably though, if you're heavily colouring the royal icing, then you're better off having something like Wilton colours because they are water-based. So something water-based would be better, but not necessarily the droplets that are in your cupboard that your nan used to use, because they could be a little bit too wet and too weak, requiring you to add too much, in which case that will change the recipe of the royal icing. So I've just combined the colour with my royal icing, and now I'm ready to let it down. Because at the moment you can see that it's fairly soft, but it's not coming together. It needs to be able to flood back together and look a bit like a mill pond, very still water mill pond. Okay, so just a few 4 or 5 drops. I've just used boiled cooled water, but you can use it direct from the tap. and a few drops at a time so that you don't over dilute this. So just a stirring motion so that you're not whipping up lots of air into your mixture. And the idea here is that we add enough so that when you cut through the middle with the knife and then shake it from side to side and count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 up to 15, this should come together again. And if it looks lovely and smooth at 15, you don't need to add any more liquid. You can just go ahead and bag it up into your piping bag. So this is not far off. You can see that it's still got a little bit of lumpy grain, a bit of texture to it. So I'm just going to add a few more drops and again go back to the stirring stage. Make sure you incorporate all the royal icing from the bowl. And I only ever work with a couple of scoops of royal icing at a time so that I can control what I'm doing. You don't need as much royal icing as you might do buttercream if you're piping flowers and what have you. Royal icing goes much further. So cut through and then 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, 10 and 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So now you can see, apart from an air bubble in here, that is fairly smooth. So that is ready to flood. You can also feel that it is like partially whipped double cream. So I would say this is more like your double thick cream before you start to whip. Okay, it's not runny like single cream. And now I'm going to load that into my bag. To help me a little bit here, I've turned my bag over so that I've only got a small area where the royal icing can go into. That way I'm not going to have lots of wasted because it's caked to the side of the bag. But also if you take yourself just a little cup and lay that so that you've got the turned over part of the bag sitting over the side of the cup, and then it's just so much easier to decant the contents of the bowl. So I'm just going to give that one last mix up. Check I'm happy with the consistency, which I think I am, and then I can go ahead and scoop it into the bowl. So just showing you a little bit about how I'm doing this. Scoop everything to the side of the bowl and then start to drop it in. Try and aim for the center of your cupler, otherwise you might find that everything will topple over. And perhaps put a weight in the cup as well, because this cup's a little bit on the light side. Okay, just try and get everything in there. And again, we can turn the bag the right way. Just hold on to it gently so you don't squeeze the royal icing up the bag accidentally. And you'll find this is much softer, so you just need to make sure that you're picking up the right bag when you start flooding your cookie. You don't want the medium consistency, you want this flooding consistency of royal icing. And we can just squidge the bag a little bit to get rid of any obvious air bubbles. So we'll just band that one up as well, and then I'm going to go ahead and prepare the white in exactly the same way. I can go straight on to adding the water because I know that I haven't got to put a colour in. The piping tip here I've got is a number 3. Okay, so that's an extra piping tip. So here's the second bowl of royal icing, and this one I'm going to put a few drops of water in, and go ahead and give it a stir in the same way. Cut it through the center and count to 15 slowly, and that should make it into runout icing, and that's going to be then bagged up into another bag, this time with a number 2 ready to pipe. Okay, to flood the cookie, that's the first thing we're going to do, and I'm going to do it in the pale green. So remember, this has got to be the green that you have let down with the water. You can see it's already starting to ooze out the piping tip, but I always have a J cloth or a damp cloth just on the side so that I can keep my piping nozzle clean as I go. Just hold on to the bag. I just scooch all the royal icing down to the bottom of the bag, and then I like to wrap my tail of my bag through so that I can give this a little twist, and then I can work without too much pressure. Just watch out when you do this because it has a tendency to squeeze everything out. So the first thing we want to do is actually start to create an outline. I don't use a different piping tip or consistency royal icing for this. I find it's actually easier to pretty much outline in the runout icing that you're going to work with, and then simply colour in. It's speedier. You don't need to let your icing dry before you actually do your filler. Okay, and now I'm putting quite a bit of pressure onto the piping bag as I'm piping into the biscuit. Some people like to keep going round in a swirl, but personally I prefer to work from one end because I can control. So once I've got some of the royal icing in there, I will start to wiggle. So my piping tip is in the mixture, and I'm starting to wiggle with the piping nozzle, moving back in towards the center of the biscuit as I do. And then as I come towards the edge here, without removing the tip from the royal icing, I can carry on squeezing and filling the biscuit. And the idea here is, if you don't lift the biscuit out, if you don't lift the piping tip out of the royal icing, you should find that you're not adding any air. So we just carry on squeezing and filling, and it can make it quite nice and plump. You've just got to watch out that you don't actually run over the edge. You just want to get almost to the edge, leaving enough room if you've got a border to go on around the edge. So I'm just starting to fill. You can be quite quick with this, keeping the piping tip in the royal icing as you go. So I feel like I'm going to go over the edge a little bit here, so I'm just going to help just a little bit, get gravity on my side to stop it from dripping over the edge of the biscuit. Sometimes it is quite tricky, especially if you're going quite close to the edge, to hold on to the biscuit. So you can use an anti-slip mat if you prefer, to sit your biscuit on, so that you've got it can be a bit more hands-free because it won't move around. So keep going with the pressure, and you want to have quite a generous filling as well. So I'm not actually touching the biscuit base here. I am just literally wiggling within the royal icing. Now, if you find that you have an area that has an air bubble in it, then you can actually pierce into the air bubble with a cocktail stick or with a scriber. Just need to stop myself from going over there. Ooh, a little bit runny. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. So we're just going to work around the biscuit, filling it in as we go, trying very hard not to let it overflow. Okay, so now we're almost at the end. I'm going to show you how to fix any air bubbles or crinkles with a scriber. You do have a limited amount of time that you can manipulate this royal icing. So just be aware of that when you're digging back in, because it could actually already have formed a skin. So I've got a bit of an air bubble here, and I think I don't want to go any further back because it was quite a while since I've actually put the run out or began the run out up here. So with the scriber, I'm just going in, not touching the biscuit, and I'm just agitating the royal icing so that I can bring it further over towards the edge if I need, but also bring in the air bubble and being able to come off. You can't just poke and drag, it's going to show. You need to kind of bring the scriber to the edge of wherever you're going to be working or wherever you want to come off. Okay, so now we have our flooded biscuit. Now this one we want to put polka dots on. So I have some prepared, we've prepared the white run out icing, so it's the same consistency, and this has a number 2 piping tip. And I'm going to drop little white dots in. Now these little light white dots with polka dots, you want to have them in a line. So start off with a clean piping tip, use your J-cloth to wipe off any excess, and then you're simply going to drop in a line of dots. Just imagine, well, you've got to make sure that the spacing is similar. Just imagine where the next one would be. So if you can't fit one on here, don't worry. So we'd come up a line and start to fill in. And because this is run out icing as well, it should simply melt in to the royal icing that's already there, but we're going to help it a little bit in a moment. Try and keep your piping tip upright while you're doing this. So come up again, in between, spacing as you go. So I'm thinking I'm not going to put one there, I'm just going to leave that bit, though I might just put one here. Okay, so it's really up to you where you want to put the dots, and then making sure your scriber is clean. If you go straight vertically down into the center of those dots, you can just wiggle them a little bit so that they start to sink into the biscuit. You could find that you don't need to do this. Clean the scriber off in between each dot. These need a little bit of agitation. These are the ones, this is the area where I flooded the biscuit first, so I can see why it might want to stand proud. You can see this one is sinking nicely. And the other one should follow suit. Now these biscuits, they benefit from having some heat applied to them. So once you've created this design and before you pipe the outline around the outside, you need to put a lamp on that gives you a bit of a heat source. And that lamp will dry the surface, set the surface with a skin. And that will not only keep the shine that you've got on the biscuit now, it will also stop the biscuit from dipping in the center because it's got a harder surface. And if you haven't got a heat lamp, you could use a dehydrator. And if you haven't got a dehydrator, you could put it in the oven on the lowest setting, so maybe 50 degrees, just for about 5 minutes. You don't want to cook it, but what it'll do is give it a heat source, so it'll help evaporate some of the water and set the skin firmly. So the next one I want to show you is this quite pretty little simple blossom, or you could call it a daisy, something like that. And for the purposes of the lesson, we're just going to use green and white. So this is going to look a little bit different, but it's quite nice. And also bear in mind that the biscuits that you're making now, not everything's going to be dry. You need to let things dry in stages before you can continue. So I'm just going to show you the start of the petal, and then we're going to let that dry for a little while. So I'm going to use the white in my number 2 to do my outline. Again, making sure your piping tip is fairly clean. So here you can be a little bit random. I'm just going to create one little petal here. So that would be my guide for the first petal, and colour it in with, well, they call this colour flow. So if you do one petal at a time, it's less likely that your outline is going to dry, which will make it much better for you. If your outline dries, then you run the risk of your outline breaking when you pipe. So having fairly liberally filled that, I can go back in with my piping tip and just wobble away to help the Royal Icing smooth out. And the same, you can use your scribe or a cocktail stick to do that as well. And then just pipe your next daisy petal. Now, I don't mind if they blend into the middle, but if you don't want them to blend into each other, then you maybe need to pipe one petal and then miss the next and pipe the next and so on. But I'm just going to be a little bit careful and not get too close. So this one's going to be a narrow one. But I like things that are off center and a bit wibbly wobbly. I prefer that to something really, really precise, and it makes it a little bit more modern looking as well. Okay, so I'm just going to be quite liberal with my squeezing. I'm squeezing as I'm drawing the tip of the piping bag to the center. Okay, so I'm being quite liberal, and if it's already smoothing on its own, you don't need to go back to it. You can maybe just give it a little tap, although that can run the risk of making it ooze off the bottom edge. So just be a bit wary of what you're doing. So now I want to make a little bit of a bigger petal, but again, I'm going to avoid trying to touch these. And we can fill this one in. So again, quite liberal squeezing. This is a number 2 piping tip that I'm using at the moment. Just because it's a slightly smaller design, you've got more control over the biscuit. If you're worried that it's going to come over the edge, just give it a little sideways lift and judder so that it hopefully will hold. We're not going to put the center in at this stage. This is going to be allowed to set a little bit. So I'm going to put it in my heat source, but you could just put it to one side and leave it for 10 minutes and then come back. But the important thing is that you keep the piping tip in the Royal Icing so that when you're squeezing out the quantity of icing to flood it, that you're not adding air. That's the important thing. So be quite liberal at the end if you think you've got to have a nice plump edge of petal, and then you can carry on bringing it from side to side. That's how I like to do it. There's lots of different ways, but this is how I like to do it. The thing is not to be afraid. And if your designs were jutting up against each other, what you would do is actually pipe one petal, and then you'd miss a petal and pipe a petal and miss a petal and so on until you have given it about 5 or 6 minutes, and you can then go back and fill in with the other petals that might be touching. That way you get this pillow effect. I've got a little air bubble here. I'm just going to pierce that and put my scriber in. I'm just in the Royal Icing, not in the biscuit, and go ahead and bring that to the center. So it's all about gentle agitation, but not pumping the air bubbles in the first place is a good thing. Flooding is the hardest, I think, out of all the techniques. It is just a bit challenging because you've got to control something that's super runny. So the last petal we're going to pop in. Just drop it in here. Get your outline and shape. And it's all right that part of the biscuit shows. You don't have to. It will become bigger. So the fact that we've got these 2 petals bleeding into each other, that's okay, because I have got an outline going on this afterwards. And that will separate the 2 petals again and give it the interest it needs. So again, squeezing as you're traveling towards the center of the biscuit, agitating as you go along to encourage it to settle flat. And that's as far as we want to take that petal at the moment. The outline and the center will go in later. I tell you what, I'll show you as well. I will show you how to get a variated center, because in here we've got pink on as the main color, and then we've got these white streaks. I'm going to show you that as well, but I'm going to do it in green. So this is my green run out, and what I do is put a little bit in the center like this. And you can go ahead, if you're quick, you can do all of them. If you're not quick, just do one at a time. Okay, so just give each petal a little bit of the green runout icing. And then go back very quickly, agitate that so it starts to sink in, and you can swirl it a little bit, that will bring it back. Now ideally, I think I should have thought of this before, but ideally you want to actually make a petal in white, add the green, make a petal in white, add the green. So do it as you go along, because you run the risk, if you're a little bit slow on this, especially when you're starting out, it's not a quick process, and you might end up having dry areas where it won't sink in, unless that's what you're after. If you want something that's a bit more textured and raised, that's absolutely fine. So I'm just swirling it a little bit to give it some interest, but this gives it a nice little center. I quite like these in green, they look nice. And then we'll do the same with this one. Okay. Try and come off into the center, because if you are going to have a raised bit, it's better to have it where you know you've got your middle going in. So that's the variation, and that's going to go into my hydrator now. The next technique I want to show you is brush embroidery, and this is very simplified and actually really quite fun to do. It can be done on cakes as well. So what I have here is a pot of water, which I'm just going to dampen the brush with, and you can just blot that on your J cloth. I have a number 2 with just normal, not run out, so this is just medium consistency Royal Icing, just moving my pot out today. So prepare the bag, get it nice and latched around your finger so you haven't got much pressure to squeeze, and then just turn that a little bit so that it so you have a minimal squeeze in here. And then you're ready to kind of squeeze your outline for the petal. So the idea here is to make it very random, and I like to be quite liberal, so I'll just squeeze one petal out at a time, and it's just a zigzag movement, bringing it into the center. And then we'll put the piping bag tip under a damp cloth or onto a damp sponge so that you know it's not going to dry out. And my dampen brush, I can just flatten the bristles just a little bit, and depending on how I now drag through this will depend on how thick the texture is. So the process is just to go almost to the end of the biscuit and then draw the brush into the center. And while you're doing this, just be mindful of what the veins look like on a petal, because that's what you're after. Now there's lots of other ways of doing this, but this is the way I like to do it, and it's just supposed to be for beginners. You know, it's just a simple technique and a really good way of finishing off a cupcake that you've got a disc of sugar paste on, or a biscuit. So here I feel like it's a little bit large on the, I've got a little bit too much Royal Icing on there, so I'm just going to come back. And don't forget, in between you need to clean the brush and also refresh it with some more water. Now if I want to, I can actually pipe over this top here to make it thicker. So I can just get a little bit more of my normal medium consistency Royal Icing in my number 2 piping bag, dampen my brush, just take off some of the moisture because you don't want it to get soaking wet. It's going to melt into the biscuit and make it soft. And then you can add in the texture that you're wanting to achieve. So that's one petal. And then we can go ahead and pipe in another petal. I do them one at a time so that they don't dry out, and just try and think petal shape when you're piping. So here I'm just going to have a little strand, but I'm also going to be liberal around this bit and back in like so. And if I want to, I can put a little bit more on top, and you can brush embroider and then add more if you'd like. So it's a nice simple technique. Drawing into the center, having wiped off the brush, you don't want too much liquid on there. Turning the brush, so of course you've got a straight edge and then you might have a flat edge, so that will give you wider vein distance between the veins, or thinner distance depending on what you're wanting to achieve. And just try and bring them all towards the center. So I'm aiming for the middle all the time, like a petal would look. So we continue with that, doing the white all the way around, and then I'll show you the second colour. So now I've done all the white petals, I can go ahead and use the medium consistency green. But at the moment, that's got the ST51 on it just to stop the royal icing from drying out. So I need to change the white tip, the number 2, unless you've got another 2, in which case you can put that on there. So that's going to be changed out onto the green, and I'm just going to swap the ST51 on here to store it. Or if you have another tip that's clean, then you could put that on there instead. Now I'm going to have white royal icing coming out of here. So I need to squeeze that and just into a pot so that you start to get the green come through. Okay, so that's starting to come through now. I've just squeezed out the white. And I'm going to, because I want to do like a jewel, I'm going to put in a little bit just below the top edge where I started. I'm just squeezing a little bit more green through because it's not quite coming through. It's coming through a bit minty, but you'll probably get the idea anyway. Okay, so once you've squeezed the colour through, you can go ahead and brush down again, the same as before. Bring the texture so it gives it two-tone and fills it in. You don't have to have as much as this, and you don't have to put it on all the petals. It's entirely up to you. I quite like mine with a lot of texture. It does make a difference. It gives it some interest. And then we go again. So probably a little bit less on this one maybe. Again, pop the piping tip under a damp cloth while you're not using it. And draw the butter, I want to say buttercream, it's not. Draw the royal icing through. You want to do this before the white dries, otherwise you're going to get crumbs. You go again, decide where you want the colour. Tip under cover, dampen brush and draw it through. And the next, until you get to the end. So to finish my blossom off, I'm going to add in some little stamens. So we need to go back to our white piping bag, which has got the medium consistency in it. Put a number 1 in there, I think, to help me out a little bit, because the green will need squeezing back through again, so we're wasting valuable colour. And so the number 1, or you can swap number 2 onto there. And the idea here when you're making dots is to actually squeeze, keeping the piping tip in the same position. So it embeds itself into the dots, and then when you've finished building the dot size up, you can relax the pressure from the piping tip and come off. And then hopefully that will give you a dot that hasn't got too much of a pimple. So we continue to pipe those. Squeeze, build the shape size, relax the pressure before you come off. They don't have to, these stamens don't have to be rounded either, so you can come off at an angle. So here, for example, they're not in a circle. So if you find that your dots are a little bit peaked, then you can just put some water onto the end of your brush. Take the excess off because we don't want to get everything soaking wet. And after you've piped about half a dozen dots, go back and touch them with the top of the paintbrush, and that will make them a bit more into pearls. Okay, so that's our little brush embroidered biscuit, which is quite pretty. With this next biscuit, this is all piped using a star tip, a leaf tip, and a writer tip, and it's all using medium consistency royal icing. And it's just about decorating the biscuit just to make it look pretty. It doesn't have to be anything really especially difficult. This is one of the easiest biscuits. So first of all, we need to do the plunged flowers, which are these ones. The rosette will go on last. So with this is a number 8, it's a star tip. You can do quite a lot with this. And what I want to do to start with is just simply place the tip of the piping tip onto the surface of my biscuit and then squeeze. That's all. No movement. It's actually touching. The tip is touching the surface. Relax the pressure before you come off to reveal a nice little pretty punched flower. I'm doing all of these in white and then we'll finish them with green. If you want to, you can turn your hand at an angle like so and open up your wrist as you pipe, and that way you will end up with something that fans out. That's more of a twist. Relax the pressure and come off. It's slightly different shape. And then you can just put pumped flowers, just little almost star shapes, so we can do them, make them a little bit smaller, just randomly where you want. So I'm just going to put a couple of those. I don't really want them to be that big. You could use a smaller star tip for this. In fact, it hasn't really taken, but I'm not worried because I can add leaves to that in a little while. So I'll just put another plunged one here. Clean off my piping tip first. So go ahead and squeeze one in here. So position, squeeze, relax the pressure, come off, and then you get yourself a nice little plunged flower. So following on from that, we can do a rosette. So as I've only got a little bit of royal icing left, I don't really want to practice this, but what I'm going to show you is you position it, have your piping tip raised just a little bit off the surface, travel a little bit away from the center, raise the piping tip, and then over pipe, so you're overlapping. You might be familiar with this if you've made rosettes for cupcakes using buttercream. So relax the pressure and then come off, and that gives you a little rosette. So at the moment, my number 2 is in my medium consistency green royal icing. So I'm going to put some dots on here. All I need to do, like I did before, is position the piping tip slightly above the biscuit. Squeeze, relax the pressure when I'm ready to come off. Give it a little wobble and come off. And if they peak, as before with the other biscuit, all you need to do is use a dampened brush. And you can make these little dots different sizes depending on what you're trying to achieve. So I'm just going to put some in here as well. The leaf tip, which is the ST51 or the 352 if you're using a Wilton, is lovely. And what you need to do is make sure that the opening, the V, is on the side of the tip. And when you pipe with this, if you squeeze, stay in place, relax the pressure, and then travel off upwards, you get a really pretty leaf. So showing you this on the biscuit, it's a really good finishing touch. So we're just going to make sure that the V is on the side. Position the bottom point edge onto the surface of the biscuit and then start to squeeze. I'm going to pretend that my little rosette here is a flower and give it a couple of leaves. And then maybe I want these little flowers to have smaller leaves. So again, remember that the V's got to be on the side. One of the pointed ends is touching down onto the cupcake. A little squirt, little squeeze, and you'll find that you'll get a tiny leaf. Now the trick here is that you want to squeeze, get the width of the leaf that you would like, then you keep traveling while you travel while you keep squeezing, and then you relax the pressure to come off. What you don't want to do is squeeze and pull back very quickly, because you'll end up breaking the leaf. So I'm just having a look at that, and I feel like I want to put one more in here. So squeeze, make contact with the surface, keep squeezing as you pull back, and then relax the pressure as you're ready to come off. And then finally, I'm going to change the tip. And I could have done this before, but the dots that I've made on there, I now want to put centers in as stamens. So I've put my number 2 back on, and I'm just going to pipe a little dot in the middle. Now you can decide whether you want this or not, because it has actually got quite a nice lacy little middle, that one, but the other one maybe not so much. So I'm probably going to fill this one. So keep your piping tip in the royal icing, relax the pressure, and then come off. And if you need to, you can dampen that down with a brush. And I'm just going to differentiate this one by doing the same. So I'm going to make a little partial dot in there. Okay, so now you've got a really pretty decorated biscuit. Okay, so something slightly harder now, and something that needs a bit of practice, but I'm going to show it to you anyway, and you can have a little go. We're going to make a little blossom. So we need to create a template. I've got a piece of greaseproof paper here that's probably 2-inch square, and I have a piping nail and a 102 or a 101 piping tip. So with a pencil, I'm actually going to just draw a dot in the center of a square of greaseproof paper, and then myself just draw 5 lines so that you've got a bit of a guide for piping your petals. So the idea is that each petal will form within those lines. Now it does need a lot of practice, so have a little go with this, and then just know that you might need to move on, and have, just every time you have some spare royal icing, have a little play. So I'm putting my 102 on my 101, so it's a petal tip, and it's what we use for blossoms, and also we pipe the roses with it as well. Scooch as much of the royal icing down to the bottom of the bag as you can and give it a twist so you're not having to apply too much pressure. Put a little bit of royal icing onto the surface of the piping nail, and then the guide that you've traced or drawn, just make it go face down onto the surface so that you can still see the lines, but you haven't got the pencil making contact with your royal icing. Now again, I haven't got a lot of royal icing in my bag, so it's possible this will shake as I'm piping, because I need to apply quite a bit of pressure. So I've got the fat end of the piping tip positioned in the center of the markings, and then I'm squeezing, but I'm keeping my piping bag still, moving my piping nail just a little bit, and when I'm ready, I've got to the other line, I can relax the pressure, don't squeeze anymore, and just come off into the center to give yourself a petal. And we're going to do that again. So the next one, again, fat end downmost, lined up with the center. make the 102, 101 go underneath the petal you've just piped. Squeeze, and as you start to squeeze, turn the nail just a fraction. Release the pressure on the piping bag, wiggle it just a little and come into the center. So that's petal number 2. Fat end down on the surface nearest the center. Tuck the piping tip under the petal. Squeeze, travel just a little bit. Don't move the bag. Relax the pressure. Come off into the center. Petal number 4, the same. Squeeze, turn the nail just a little bit. Don't move the bag. Relax the pressure. Come off. Now this last one, you're going to need to turn the angle of the piping tip because you don't want to crash into and damage the first petal. So you create the petal in the same way, but you raise, as you're changing the angle, you're coming up just a little bit to get in there. Okay, and there's a simple little blossom. Now that blossom, you can finish it with a little center. So I've got a number 2 piping tip in my green as well at the moment, so I can just simply squeeze a little dot of green into the middle, and that's your blossom. Now this blossom, we can just gently ease that off the flower now, and this then can go on the side and just dry, and once it's dry you'll be able to peel it off. And these decorations can be stored in a tin with greaseproof layers. Once it's all dry, you can put it into an airtight tin, and then that will last for months and months. And your biscuits, once you've got the decoration dry, you can store your biscuits in a tin as well, in between layers of greaseproof paper, and they will stay fresh for about 2 weeks. Okay, so I wanted to show you how to make these roses, but they're simple ones. They're actually piped onto a cocktail stick and then set on a piece of greaseproof paper. And once they're finished, and they're dry, you can peel them off and stick them onto a cupcake or anything you would like. So I'll give you an idea of how this works. Take a piece of greaseproof paper, 2" by 2" and feed a cocktail stick through the center. Then if you take a pair of scissors, just to take the very pointy end of the cocktail stick, that just makes life a little bit easier because you've got a larger surface to work with. Now these are tiny roses, they're not big ones. We're going to use the 102 or the 101. I'm going to be pushing it with the 102, so let's hope it works. So here goes. So the fat end is lowermost, making contact with the cocktail stick. Your cocktail stick is going to be the thing that's rotating. We're only really doing this movement with the piping tip. So fat end down, the angle of your piping tip is going to be inwards, and then we create the first petal. So in effect, what you're doing is drawing an arc each time. So we come a little way away from the join, pipe and turn over. So you can see you can make little rosebuds very easily. And then we're going to go again, pipe and turn over, come off. If you make contact with the fat end, which is lowermost, onto the royal icing, it should encourage it to stick, and that way you can carry on to create your petals. So that's a third petal, and then you run the risk of it all going horribly wrong, so you need to kind of know when to stop. So this I'm just going to pull off, and there you have a little rosette, a little rosebud. And this we can embellish a little bit by using the green with our leaf tip on it. So I'm just going to change that out. You'll probably think, well, she was piping with green, but it's come out white. But I'd run out, I'm almost out of my white royal icing. So I've just changed the petal tip from my white onto my onto this one. Now, we just want to add some leaf detail. So what I'm going to do, you can put it on your piping nail if you would like, but you do run the risk of it flopping or falling off in the process of making these leaves, but just so that I can raise this a little bit. So you've got your rose shape, and you just take a look at it, decide where you want the leaf, remembering that you're going to have the cut edge on the side of the leaf, squeezing and piping a leaf. And you can just have another little look and decide where you want these. You don't have to go crazy, you can just have a couple like that. That would look really pretty. Or if you want to, we can have one coming up a little way on the other side. So that rose then would be left to dry, and then you can peel it off. And with a little bit of royal icing squeezed onto the back of that, it can be secured onto the biscuit. To do the piped pearls or the piped snail trail around the edge, you can use just normal medium consistency royal icing, but you can also use flooded royal icing, although you do take the risk that it might actually start to droop down. So I'm going to put this onto a non-slip mat just to help me, because it means I can move it round. And take my white runout icing, which has got the number 2 piping tip in it. The idea here is to pipe a snail trail where you make contact with the surface, squeeze, get the bulb size you want, and then you release the pressure a little bit as you drag the piping tip towards you to create a tail. And then leaving a gap, you then pipe the next pearl shape and create a tail. And if you leave the same gap each time, so I'm just going to make this closer so I don't run out off the board, you can see that you can create something that looks really quite nice. So even though that's flooded icing, so really soft consistency, thin consistency royal icing, it is actually holding. So having tested that, I'm going to give it a go around the side of the biscuit. My only scary point here is that I haven't got much room at all. So maybe I'll come back to that bit. I think I'm going to start just past. Okay, so here goes. We can use the mat, the non-stick mat, to move it around. So at an angle 45 degrees to the biscuit, we're going to start to pipe little snail trail. And don't be afraid, each time it's a circle, so you've got to move the biscuit. And this has been under the heat source for about 10-15 minutes now. So although it's still wet underneath, it is crispy enough for me to be able to pipe against it, touching very, very lightly. Try and remember to move the non-stick surface, the little non-slip mat, rather than the biscuits. Just going to make your life a lot easier. Now I can see the initial teardrop shapes that I created or started with are starting to hang a little bit. So that might be an indication really that I should have used a medium consistency royal icing. There's something you can do instead. So we'll just finish off going all the way round. This last one's always tricky to get in. It actually is almost likely to be just a little dot. And if you need to, you can use your dampened brush to just stop that from peaking. Okay, so now you have your little pearl outline. So that needs to go quickly under the heat source again, so your lamp, just to stop that from bleeding. So I've just got this one out, which is one of the ones we did right at the beginning of the lesson. And I'm going to outline this. Now you could outline it in white. I'm going to see what it looks like to outline it in green, and you can decide whether you prefer the white. So I am using the runout icing again, but you could use your number 2 or your number 3 and just the normal medium consistency royal icing. I'm going to start to outline from the center. And what I want to do is keep the piping tip quite raised from the surface so that I have control. The higher up you are, the more control you have over where you can place your royal icing. And then come off in the center. Okay, if you need to, you can use a dampened brush just to take the little peak. But you'll possibly find that this will flood because it is flooding icing, so it might actually give it a wider outline finish, but it will flatten a little bit. So again, because this is the run out icing, there's very minimal pressure coming out of this bag. It's flowing almost on its own. And you can start and finish where you like. Just keep the pressure constant and let the icing flow. Keep your piping tip high so you can slow your piping down. Dampening as you go. Just going to turn the biscuit round for the last two. So again, make contact. It seems like we've got a lot of joins in the center, so you don't have to necessarily go back to the center each time. You can cut it short. So here I could start just a little bit short of the middle. Outline, and let it drop back down again. Use your dampen brush. Now in the center, because that's so wet, we could just give that a little bit of a wiggle. And that'll come nice and flat. Here I can see a little bit of the edge of the petal, but I need to be careful because if I start attacking that with a pen, with a scribe or with the brush, it's going to be a mess. But if you just give it a little shake, you'll probably find that that will attach. So that looks quite nice. And I need to wait a little while before I can put a mound in the center. So that could go on the side to dry a little bit longer. Okay, so what I've got here is some black spectral paste colour. You can use petal dust and alcohol if you like, but you just got to be careful that this isn't too wet because we don't want to melt the icing. And I've just got a very, very fine brush. This is a 00, very fine paintbrush. And we're ready to draw some streaks. Now, this has only been drying for a short amount of time, so it's probably more ideal if you leave this to dry for a length of time. So I just want to show you, though, how to draw the, some texture. You want to draw some vein lines in there. That's what I'm aiming for. So I'm just supporting the brush with my other hand, and I just want to run the brush very gently through the inner part of each petal. Now I'm avoiding painting the outline because I don't want any on there, and also the outline's only just gone on. I'm going to draw some more lines on here. So you can have long ones and short ones, whatever you would like. But it just shows you that you can actually draw outlines and detail in using the paste color. I feel like I want to give it a few freckles as well, so we're just going to very, very lightly dot those on. You can be a bit more confident and a bit more brash with it if it's dry. And this just brings the cartoony look out. It's quite pretty even with the green and white just on its own. But try and be random with your detailing so it looks interesting but not too uniform. Now, having painted that, we would need to let it dry, obviously, but I want to put a little circle in the center as the stamen, and knowing that I've only got my green or my white, I'm feeling like I want to put white in the middle. So rather than doing an outline in the medium consistency, I'm going to outline it in the flooding and fill it in. I do run the risk of this breaking though, because I have only just filled the outline in. So I'm just going to try and do a little bit of a circle raised part here, and then without catching the outline in green underneath, I'm just going to agitate the royal icing to get it to go where I want. So we've got a nice little circle center, and then I need to come off, so I need to just come out of it. I've got a little raised part here now, and what I want to do is just take the scriber and give that a little bit of a wobble. And I'm going to keep my black, so when this is a little bit dry, or should we say when it's dry, I can put some dots like I have on this center here. And you can see just a selection of different two-tone biscuits with that same design on it can look really quite pretty. To finish this biscuit, we just need to peel off and attach the rose. Now this one has barely come out of the dryer, so it is a good idea to leave them at least overnight before you peel them. That's feeling a little bit on the wet side. I'm a bit worried that the leaves are going to peel off. So just be so careful because it is actually still a bit wet underneath. And I'm going to take just a little bit of my white here. This is just the medium consistency royal icing. Pipe on some of that royal icing to the back, and then decide where that's going to go and gently drop it in place. Again, I'm not going to touch it anymore because that is still quite soft. And that's really pretty. I like that one. So this has had about 10 minutes in the dehydrator just to dry that center white piece. And just to finish off, I'm going to very gently dab on some freckles. So literally just lay the point of the brush onto the paste, and that gives it some interest. And there you have your finished biscuit selection. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to get in touch, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. Bye bye.